Hello, my name's Sarah Neville and I'm the Global Health Editor at the Financial Times. On behalf of the FT and the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, EFPIA, I'd like to welcome you all to this digital dialogue on strengthening European health systems, how to invest in innovation while driving efficiencies. Before we start the conversation, can I invite everyone to submit questions they'd like our panel to answer by entering them in the Q&A box to the right of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as the conversation progresses. Our event platform is Bizaboo, but if anyone has any problems, please email ftlive@ft.com. And we'd also warmly encourage you to share any thoughts or reflections on social media using the hashtag FTHealth. You can also head over to the event community to chat to other delegates and continue the conversation there. And now on with the discussion. This post-pandemic period is a difficult time for health systems. COVID-19 has exacerbated long-standing challenges posed by aging populations and the associated rise in chronic disease that's driving ever greater demand for health services. And on top of this, we now have the energy crisis, inflation, and Russia's war in Ukraine, all of which have left policymakers with even more difficult choices to make about where they spend scarce resources. So how do leaders in the health and pharmaceutical sector make the case that investing in treatments and technologies can ease budgetary pressures, at least in the longer term, and dispel the idea that keeping health systems financially sustainable is incompatible with innovation? Well, here to discuss all this with me, I have four great panelists, each of which will bring a different perspective to our discussion. They are Deborah Dunshire, President and CEO of Lundbeck, Panos Kanavos, Assistant Professor of International Health Policy at the London School of Economics, Agneta Carlsson, Director General of the Dental and Pharmaceutical Benefits Agency, whose remit, I think I'm right in saying, Agneta, is to determine whether a pharmaceutical product or dental care procedure will be subsidised by the state. And Peter Liese, an MEP who's also a physician and the European People's Party coordinator for the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Safety. Panos, perhaps I could kick off with you, if I may, and come to you for an economic perspective. What is the economic calculation when we think about the value of innovation and how it can drive efficiencies? Obviously, innovation may well require a large initial outlay, but how can it help to reduce costs, if you believe it can, in the medium or longer term?
Thank you, Sarah. It's always a balancing act, but I think we need to reflect on a few things to start with. One is effectiveness. We want new treatments, new therapies, new interventions to be effective. In other words, that they deliver benefit to patients. We want them to be efficient, and by means of efficiency, we are talking about maximization of health gain. Or maximization of effectiveness, if you want, relative to a given budget. But you also mentioned the magic word budget, and that points to affordability. So here's a sort of a big conundrum here. When we're talking about efficiency, one way of reflecting that and putting the effectiveness into our discussion, what we want to do is ensure that the additional cost from the introduction of a new technology or a new intervention is proportional to the additional benefit, to the health gain that we achieve. In other words, now there are a few conundrums here which we need to address. One of them is that very frequently the additional cost is more than proportional than the additional benefit. And therefore that leads to exhaustive discussions about what is benefit, what uncertainties in the benefit do we have, how do we account for all kinds of clinical as well as economic uncertainties, because not all not all new treatments are effective 100%. So there is a lot of potential loss that we are facing. And the other conundrum, of course, is that whereas we may have treatments that are efficient, in other words, that we maximize health gain and we keep costs proportional to the additional gain, additional cost proportional to the additional gain, but the treatments may be unaffordable altogether, simply because the number of patients that we have is very high, or because the additional or because the additional cost relative to the cost per unit, in other words, the cost per patient, is far too high. There have been numerous examples of that sort. So I'm not entirely sure about the efficiency arguments altogether and how they link up with affordability. For sure, we need to address all these things in a discussion about overall healthcare financial sustainability. So it's a very tricky balancing act between effectiveness, efficiency, and affordability at health system level.
And you mentioned that there are occasions where this equation definitely has kind of gone out of whack, as it were. Can you think of some specific examples where an innovation, a new treatment hasn't delivered what was hoped?
Well, I think treatments deliver significant health gain, and I think we've got very good examples of treatments that have actually been extremely successful over time. So I don't want to basically talk about treatments that haven't delivered, but I think they have delivered in various degrees. So we've seen successful therapies. For example, we're looking at things like the introduction of statins several years ago. So these are old examples, and these are very effective, in fact cost effective. We've seen not necessarily in the treatment of pharmaceuticals, but in the context of medical devices and surgical procedures. Laparoscopic surgery, for example, is very effective, but also efficient from a cost perspective. Angioplasty and stent insertion. But if you look at it from a perspective of treatments which are let's say very expensive from a cost per unit basis, and potentially also cost effective, then multiple treatments in the context of rare diseases, but also oncology, have these traits, these characteristics. So they pose a significant challenge for healthcare systems if we're looking at it from a budgetary standpoint, and very frequently from a cost effectiveness perspective. There's another argument, of course, that says innovation is delivered over time, and that is something to bear in mind. For example, in the context of oncology, we have seen significant improvements in 1, 5, and 10-year survival over the last quarter of a century. So yes, over time treatments may deliver, but in the short to mid-term, let's say for a 1, 2, or 3 year perspective, some of these treatments are hugely expensive and pose significant challenges for healthcare systems. And obviously, those challenges differ according as the affordability of different healthcare systems varies, which is a particular concern also from a European standpoint, given the inequalities, given the financial issues that each country faces, and so on and so forth.
So something may make economic sense for one European nation, but not for another.
Not necessarily for another. And I think this is transparent from the perspective of health technology assessment agencies and healthcare systems that operate in different jurisdictions. And that's why, for example, this is one of the reasons, there are others as well, whereby a technology may be considered as clinically and cost effective in one jurisdiction, but not necessarily in another. Now, clearly there are other factors that feed into that equation. But I'm sure that Agneta from TLV may be able to tell us more about it later on.
Yes, and I would very much like to hear from you next, Agneta. But first, I'm just going to introduce a video that EFPIA has created looking at some of the innovations which can reduce longer-term healthcare costs. So this will be an additional element, backdrop to our discussion. So I think we're about to run that video now.
What does innovation mean for patients now and in future generations?
Perhaps not.
Innovation can improve outcomes for patients and pass on savings to help create stronger health systems too. Today, the HPV vaccine prevents nearly every case of cervical cancer. It has also led to significant healthcare savings being passed on across Europe. Hepatitis C patients can now be cured to lead active, healthy lives. And the cost of the treatment is offset by other savings. Cancer patients prefer to be treated at home rather than in hospital. And home-injected therapies can help improve adherence, alleviate demands on healthcare systems, and improve sustainable access to cancer care. Gene therapies could transform the lives of people living with hemophilia, replacing unpleasant weekly intravenous treatments. Innovation means passing on hope and new cures. It also means passing on resilient health systems. By backing innovation in Europe, we can tackle the health challenges of today and tomorrow, so we can pass on a healthier future to more and more people.
So, yes, unfortunately, I wasn't able to see the video my end. I'm not sure whether the rest of the panel did see it. But anyway, the audience will have seen it. So, Agneta, perhaps I could pick up where I just left off and ask you to respond to what Panos was saying. You're very much at the sharp end of these decisions and these evaluations about whether a medicine should be publicly subsidized. Are those decisions becoming more difficult, would you say, or in an era of sort of ever more straitened finances? How has the current sort of post-pandemic backdrop affected your work?
Well, thank you very much. First, I would like to say that it is very impressive now, I think, the speed of innovation and new technologies, and that's very encouraging that is taking place. And HTA agencies, as well as pricing and reimbursement agencies, we're of course welcoming in new innovations and new medicines that are coming, and we work hard, of course, to find solutions to give access, knowing that we are the last line before the patients. But well, as you asked, if there are any changes now after the pandemic, well, of course, the healthcare systems in Sweden, as well as in other countries, have budgetary problems, and also a lot of operations and treatments that patients that have been waiting for treatments, and that has been postponed during the pandemic. So I think there is quite a high pressure on the healthcare systems for many reasons now. But we've seen for quite a long time now that many of these new medicines that are coming for rare diseases, but also in other areas, they come with a very high price level, and also many of them with not as good as evidence as we should, that we would like to see. And then therefore the decision making for the HTA agencies and reimbursement agencies are more difficult today in many cases than they used to be. So the decision making is more complex for us, really. So what we need is sometimes more data. We need to be able to follow up our decisions, maybe have more conditional decisions and so on. So it is more complicated, I think. But I also would like to say that in many times when you discuss these issues, the companies talk about innovation, like everything is innovative, and we say it's hard to pay. But what we need is to be able to discuss much more together, to cooperate and to be creative together. And we as payers need to be more distinct on what kind of medical needs do we have, and what kind of medical needs are we prepared to pay for, because everything is not innovative. Many of as Panos also discussed, there are many medicines that are good, they're not dangerous, but they don't add much value. And that is something we really have to be clear about. What kind of medicines can we pay for, and are we willing to pay for? And we also need to be more creative when it comes to payment models and so on, that we can share the risk together. And I think that the vaccine example during the pandemics is a very good example on how can the society and the payers and the developers and the academia work together when you have a very, very important problem together. But then also, as one of the questions that Panos raised, is that of course our countries are different. I mean, some medicines, some treatments are innovative in one country, but not in another, because we have different treatment traditions. We have different payment models. So that is also something you need to have to take into account, that we are different, and there is still national competence how to construct the healthcare system. So, but I think there is a very positive development. We can do a lot of things together. We don't have to be, I don't think we should be scared to have intense discussions between the society and authorities and the industry. We need to work together, but we do have to have respect for each other's roles and roles and missions, and we are not able to pay for everything. That is I think the industry needs to have sometimes more respect for that there is the affordability problem is very, very big for many countries and many health systems.
Yes. Thank you very much, Agneta. Deborah, perhaps on that note, as the industry representative, I could come to you. I mean, Agneta was saying that perhaps she hasn't always got sufficient data about a new medicine, and the template of health systems working very closely with industry during the development of the COVID vaccines is a good model, she thinks. How do you respond to that when you're deciding which drugs to pursue, which ones to bring into late stage trials? Are you thinking about the sort of wider value to the health system of a treatment?
I think certainly from the get-go, we'd like to think about the overall value to the health system. But the first order of business is always to solve the biological challenge and the scientific challenge of, do we have a medicine that can actually engage with the right biology and control a disease? And it's only after we answer that question, which requires significant investment, that we have the opportunity to consider where the value could really be applied. So while we consider that throughout the development of a drug, it's sort of which is the first order of business. But I really would build on what Agneta and Panos also said, that we together need to think about the value of innovation within the health systems. And sometimes the value is maybe not as broadly considered when we think about health systems. Normally we'll look at their budgets within the health system, but some of the benefits actually accrue to society in a different way. As an example, when we think about things like Alzheimer's disease or depression, there's a huge impact on families and caregivers. So there's the individual cost of therapy and treatment for a patient experiencing those diseases. Then there's the cost of the loss of productivity for that individual. For instance, in depression, just an example of a Danish statistic, depression creates about 14% of the days lost from work. So if we can put people back to work, there's a productivity gain. People who are experiencing depression or dementia also require care from their families. And when we look at dementia, there's about 6 caregiver hours per day for people cared for in home setting. How do we contemplate impacting that? If a medicine is able to impact that, how do we together systematically think about the benefit overall to society's ability to be economically productive, socially impactful, and across the system of society. So we together need to think about not only the medicine and how to pay for it, but also how to think about these benefits across society. I 100% support the need to work more closely and in strong dialogue across academia, policymakers, industry, and other stakeholders, including patients, because it is something that we together need to work on. When I think about the COVID pandemic, I also agree that that's solving a sort of an existential societal challenge, and we did it together. Of course, industry and academia providing the insights on the vaccine, the manufacturing capabilities to scale up in a high quality manner, governments prioritizing and supporting innovation that was required even before it was ready. So I think there's an enormous amount of learning that we can take from that going forward. Perhaps I'll stop there.
Really interesting. And do you find as a company that you're engaging with health technology agencies sort of earlier than you might have done, sort of 10 years ago? Is there more dialogue at an earlier stage now, would you say?
I'd say much more than there was 10 years ago, certainly. Not as much as we can do and need to do. And I think the pathways for that early engagement and dialogue are being formulated. And I would strongly encourage that we continue down that path, formulating those appropriate pathways for engagement at an earlier stage.
Interesting. Yes, thank you very much, Deborah. And perhaps I could finally come to you, Peter, if I may. You've got an overview of what is happening in Europe, across Europe. I mean, to what extent do you feel that European countries, European governments are grasping the importance of investment in health and medical innovation? Or is that still a case that has to be made quite widely across the bloc?
Short answer, of course, is yes. But I, of course, want to go a bit more in detail.
Yes.
Many of the speakers mentioned already the pandemic, and I think we tend to forget what we achieved together. When we look what happened in China during the last, let's say, 1.5 years, they didn't have an effective vaccine because for ideological reasons, they didn't accept the European mRNA or the Western mRNA vaccine. We were successful. And this was a good cooperation. It was European money, national money, but also private risk capital. And the mRNA technology is, of course, as you may know, very promising also to address other diseases. So we should speak about these kind of success stories to counterbalance the debate that innovation, pharmaceutical industry is always an evil. Unfortunately, we have the vaccine deniers, but the majority of the society still understands that we have done something good. The question how we can distinguish a real breakthrough, an innovation that helps the patient and is cost efficient, is complex. I value that. When I ask different stakeholders, what is the success of HTA? It was the only health legislation that we did in the last parliament. Industry is telling me mainly, you don't have Me Too drugs anymore. It's only innovation what comes to the market now. Others that have to pay or independent experts see it a bit different. That's why we need to continue to work here. And I have also a quite concrete point that will be addressed hopefully in the Commission proposal on the pharma legislation the day after tomorrow. But one point I want to make very clear, because two speakers have said what may be efficient and what may be an added value in one country is not efficient or no added value in another country. I think this argument is strongly exaggerated. We are not so different. So if a cancer drug makes people survive better, there is no drug that makes you survive 2 years longer after cancer in France and only 6 months in Germany. So this argument shouldn't be exaggerated. My assessment is there's much more national politics involved. There's much more individual assessment than facts. And that's why I'm really happy that we have this European HTA. But I think we need to do better. And I very much like the concept of unmet medical needs or highly unmet medical needs in the pharma legislation. The only question is, will we be successful when if the Commission proposed in their leak, reduce the incentives, and you can only get back to the former incentive if you do something very revolutionary and market in all 27 member states? Or shouldn't we have, in Germany we say Zuckerbrot and Peitsche. So you have a stick and a carrot. So where is the carrot? In the league, there was no carrot. I hope on Wednesday we will see also a carrot for those that do really break through. They should do better than in the past, and they should be rewarded better.
Interesting. Panos, I don't know whether you want to come back on what Peter was saying.
Yes.
Your point about differential values in different countries.
Yes, of course. I don't think we disagree on the issue of additional benefit. What we may be disagreeing on is the issue of additional cost because of different affordabilities across member states. I think that's the key point. Now, of course, if we see a new technology that gives us, compared with the standard of care, some significant additional benefit in terms of months or years of survival with excellent quality of life, then of course this is worth reflecting on, and most definitely worth reimbursing, and for healthcare systems to give a positive coverage recommendation on that front. But the issue of differential affordability is definitely an issue. Someone, the French healthcare system can afford certain things. The Polish healthcare system or the Slovak healthcare system can afford certain things. I don't think we're talking about equal affordability there. So I think it's definitely something that we probably need to reflect on and address somehow, with either different thresholds or different pricing arrangements, which I suspect are also in place based on ability to mitigate risks, also based on different affordabilities. And I think the issue of risk mitigation strategies has been raised also earlier on. That's one way of looking at it. Of course, there are many other ways, and that takes us into a whole new domain about what is value, how do we address uncertainties, and how do we address limited affordabilities. That takes us into another very interesting, also from a European perspective, discussion around pricing arrangements and whether some of these pricing arrangements, because of the different value different systems place on new therapies, these pricing arrangements need to be publicly available or confidential in nature. So it's as usual a complex discussion that transcends the whole issue of value and value assessment.
Indeed. Deborah or Agneta, did you want to come back in on any of those points?
Well, go ahead.
You go, Agneta, go ahead.
Well, I think that when it comes to different things in different countries, I think there are actually some treatment traditions. I think when it comes to, at least in some areas, countries have different traditions when it comes to treatments. That is an issue, but it's not the whole. It doesn't explain everything. But you have to take into account of that. But then also we have this different legislation in each country too, that we have different ways to look at health economics, for instance, and to do this kind of horizontal prioritization, and we need to treat different applications, in our case, equal, no matter what kind of treatment it is. And then we need to have a good evidence, we need to have good studies and a lot of data, and many times we don't. And then it is very difficult for us to accept these new medicines. And then maybe in other countries, they don't have sometimes exactly the same criteria as we need to have when we do our decision making. So there is legislation and treatment traditions, but I also think that in many ways we can do more or less the same the decisions or so. And I think with this new HTA regulation, I think that will be a good opportunity now to have, as Deborah was mentioning earlier, discussions between industry and payers early in the regulative process on what kind of prices are we discussing, what kind of treatments are really important, and where do we need more incentives to stimulate the development of medicines. But I want really to stress that all new medicines are not innovative. They are not, and we can pay a lot for innovation, but everything that comes that are new are not innovative. And that is really important to realize.
I think just stepping in, if I may, with respect to what Panos and Peter were discussing about, is there a difference between countries in the potential impact of a medicine? And the answer is the data is the data. So if it's a benefit to a quality of life or a survival, it'll be the same largely across the countries. But what is different is how a particular country can prioritize its budget towards different things. And therefore, as an industry, as we looked at the leaked draft, we said within our control is to submit for pricing and reimbursement in all markets. But it is the remit of the country to determine how they will prioritize for their citizens a particular innovation. The other thing about, how can we create more competitiveness for Europe versus other jurisdictions or other geographies to encourage innovation. And I think, again, in the leaked draft, incentives for a stable IP framework were actually reduced, which overall has the impact of reducing European competitiveness. There's a very strong industry, innovative industry within Europe, but the other geographies compete for that industry. And so it is very important that there are the appropriate incentives to maintain an innovative industry. So it highlights the theme of these discussions, that it is bigger than one issue. It is a systems issue for all of us in managing health appropriately within a societal context, and that it requires collaboration across, from policymaker to industry to academia to regulator, for us to thread the needle to be able to bring innovation to patients appropriately within the budgets of various countries.
Very, very interesting. I mean, just picking up on your point about budgets, does everybody think that it's possible to change the narrative away from the notion of health spending as a sort of sunk cost and redefine it as investment? Because at the moment, I think most countries, if not all countries in Europe, have to keep their health budgets in balance annually. Because health is seen as a sort of day-to-day operational expenditure, whereas I understand spending on defence equipment, for example, is seen as an investment and it's not subject to such strict rules. Do you think we need different accounting rules that can recognise that innovation, as several of you have mentioned, can sometimes take years to deliver, and it won't always deliver on a sort of neat budgetary 1 year cycle? I don't know who'd like to kick off on that point. Peter, maybe?
Yes, of course. So first of all, on defense, the narrative has only changed last year. So it was always popular to say we need to spend less money on defense. And now we see how important it is to be able to defend our values, our principles. So that also may change on health if we do it right. But of course, we cannot say everything what you invest in health is good. When the Troika came to Greece, they understood that the share of generics in Greece is lower than in most of the other European countries. And that is, of course, not something where you can say this is good when a country that has no money spends on the very expensive original medicine, while other countries already shifted to generics. So efficiency is key when you want to do this argument. But also, I think the argument that when a government or a parliament says we have no money for this treatment, we need to double check. So first of all, it's not only the question how rich or how poor a country is, it's a question how efficient is the healthcare system. And it's sometimes in poor countries not more efficient than in rich countries. Second question, how much money, how much of your budget percentage-wise do you spend on health? And do you really think you should spend less percentage? Third question, how much of the European funds, cohesion funds, RRF, so the Next Generation EU, there's a lot of money that can be spent on healthcare. And it's a question of negative national priority, a priority for other things, negative priority for health, if member states don't. So just to say I'm poor, I cannot, is not enough. You need to double check this. And then the real efficient ones, the real breakthroughs needs to come to the market. And for industry, it's also different kinds of challenges. So it is not easy to market a drug in 27 member states. And that's why I hope the draft that comes on Wednesday will be more, let's say, acceptable for industry, because when a country definitely doesn't want a drug, you cannot punish the pharmaceutical company. But on the other hand, when life-threatening cancer drugs are available only in 5 countries, and scientists agree it would be helpful for all the patients in all the countries, that has to change, because we cannot say we have done our job when a life-threatening medicine is available only in 5 countries in Europe.
Yes, but what about, Panos, this sort of point about whether different accounting rules might be needed to sort of drive a longer term view of the effect of health spending, I guess.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And I mean, I am in broad agreement with Peter. I think he raised some very extremely valid points. Interestingly, both the Commission but also the OECD have done work on potential wasteful spending on health. And I recall, an OECD report from not so long ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, that highlighted exactly this title: wasteful spending on health. So, for sure, efficiencies can be achieved, and for sure, the way we spend scarce resources can be improved in many different ways. But and to the point about cost versus investment, of course, it is investment in health, obviously, because we are investing in health and our well-being. But I wanted to introduce an additional dimension, which is more important in the current debate. And I'll bring to you a very interesting statistic. And that statistic says that in most developed countries, as much as between 2/3 and 3/4 of total healthcare expenditure is spent on 10% of patients. I repeat the statistic. As much as as much as 3/4 of healthcare expenditure is spent on 10% of patients. And that 10% of patients is a high need and high cost group, characterized by significant prevalence of chronic disease, multimorbidity, and complicating factors. And the big question, of course, Sarah, here is whether we know who this group is. What are the constituent members, so to speak, of this group of patients? And the answer is yes, that we do, because we do have information systems, we do have prescribing databases, we know what is going on in most our healthcare systems nowadays. And if this is the case, then we can channel resources by segmenting patients and targeting treatment where it is most needed. So I think this is one of the ways we can improve significantly the way we deliver healthcare. And that doesn't only mean pharmaceuticals or healthcare technologies, but healthcare in general. So what we are lacking perhaps is that integration and care coordination that some of these people actually need in order to showcase the significant benefit that we all expect from our healthcare system. That's an additional dimension to the aspects that Peter very nicely mentioned earlier on.
So it underlines the importance of shifting health systems to a more preventative focus, treating conditions further sort of upstream before they become more serious and expensive. But Agneta, yes, what are your reflections on?
No, but I totally agree on that we need to have a lot more focus on prevention, and also as was showed here in the video, to have more treatment at home and self treatment and things like that could reduce the costs for the healthcare, and also to lessen the entry of patients to the healthcare system. But we also need to be a lot more tough on all the treatments, all the medicines, to rule out those that are not efficient anymore. I think it's not only to add on new medicines and treatments. You need also to be able to outline some of them, and I think that's something that the healthcare is not as good on as it should be. But then when it comes to budgeting and innovation, I think at least at least in Sweden, I mean, we put a lot of investments when it comes to research and projects and things in the whole life science sector. And those are, I mean, not just for 1 year or so. I mean, there are many of these our programs are long term. So I mean, and that's the same on European level and in many countries. So I think we need to look at that research parallel to what we do when it comes to the exact budget each year for the healthcare system. So I mean, they really complement each other for short term and long term. But then also, when we decide upon reimbursement, we don't look at the budget as such. We look at, I mean, we look at the cost compared to treatments that are used, but also as Pano said in the introduction, the health benefit, the additional health value, and so we don't take, at least in Sweden, we don't have a budget limits in crowns or euros. We do comparisons and look at the added value of health for the benefit for the patient, and that is, I mean, that's the main ingredients in the value-based system that we use, which you also can, of course, have well, criticize in some ways, but I think that is a good way on looking at the innovation. We pay for innovation.
Really interesting. I mean, there was a study by IQVIA, wasn't there, recently, which actually showed that the net expenditure of pharmaceuticals in Europe has been flat for the last 20 years as a share of overall healthcare expenditure. And the rise in healthcare cost is being driven more by an aging population. But given that overall rise in costs, Deborah, do you think there's a danger that governments and health systems just simply won't have the headroom to pay for innovative medicines?
Well, I think, as Agneta, Panos, and also Peter have said, there is the ability to pay for innovation that changes outcomes. I think with the COVID pandemic, had we not been able to lift the lockdowns, the whatever the cost was, and it was high, for vaccines was multiply paid back to society by the ability to return society to more normal. And that's a macro global example that happens at a lower individual level for many medicines. And I think that we need to think about taking into account these dynamic kind of economic modeling. And I know in Denmark, they certainly have these for initiatives around homelessness or the impact of expanding kindergartens to look at, how does this affect overall GDP over time, the labor supply into the market, other factors. And I think we need to consider these things more broadly. And it brings to mind, building on one of Panos's points, and also one of Agneta's, focusing on preventive care, making sure that we can address some of those chronic diseases and keeping people out of the most expensive time of care, maybe hospitalizations, needing chronic care, and using data to be able to focus our resources and understand the drivers behind that overutilization. I think there's a lot of themes here that are coming together that will allow us to look at the impact of a particular intervention more broadly than its simple cost. Of course, Agneta has also said, of course, the health benefit is taken into consideration, but then considering the broader societal impact on productivity, and then using our data, and particularly, I'm sitting in a Nordic country right now that has remarkable access to population data. And that is an incredibly powerful tool that I think we are only at the beginning of being able to use the power of, and we should invest more behind.
Fascinating. On that note, I'm actually going to turn to questions from the audience. We've got so many coming in. The first one is from Thomas Alvin, who is Executive Director of Strategy and Healthcare Systems at EFPIA. He says Panos mentioned statins as a successful case. These were seen as a challenge when they were first introduced as innovative medicines, but are now generic and continuing to deliver value and saving costs for health systems. Doesn't this show the need for a long-term perspective? Thomas asks. We've been talking quite a bit about that, haven't we? Whether we need to sort of reframe the speed with which we expect a new treatment to reduce costs. Panos, as you're the person referenced in the question, do you want to respond to that?
I think in the second part of what I mentioned in my introductory remarks, I alluded to the long-term perspective that we have in gauging the potential of innovation, for example, in the area of oncology. So we've seen, if you are to showcase at the macroeconomic level significant gains in survival and or quality of life, you're probably not going to be able to, because these are, very small and incremental. But if you take a sort of a 10, 15, 20, 25 year perspective and look at what used to happen in the mid-1990s compared with what is happening now in multiple cancers, then you probably notice a significant improvement in survival gains and quality of life. So we do need to have a general perspective on this, a macroeconomic and a longer term perspective. But obviously there are also trade-offs that we need to make in the short term, particularly when evidence is not as certain. And of course, the evidence that we had on statins in the 1980s, or towards the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s, when they were first introduced, was reasonable, was very good, and I think that the drugs performed reasonably well. But compared with the average oncology drugs that we see today, we have significant uncertainties. That may want us to rethink the way we package evidence. I think this is a broader discussion that needs to involve regulators, HTA bodies, insurance, and so on. So the healthcare system, as well as manufacturers, particularly around the use of efficacy versus effectiveness in real-world data, and the use of real-world data from a regulatory health technology assessment perspective, so as to not ensure, but at least safeguard that new medicines are introduced and the uptake of those new medicines is reasonable, provided that they offer the appropriate safeguards to healthcare systems. So you will notice that there are multiple trade-offs from a long, but also from a short-term perspective.
Would others like to come in on that point? Any other?
May?
Yes, Peter.
Yeah, just shortly. So I completely support this long-term perspective. It's very important. You cannot see all the benefits when you do the investment. That's logical for any investment. But where I just want to be careful is that we don't intervene with the European budgeting rules, because everybody that does a long-term investment will say, I don't count for the Maastricht criteria. But on the other hand, we have to save the future of our children, not only when it comes to climate and other challenges, but also when it comes to the burden. And that's why it's also a question of priorities. So let's not spend more from the national budget overall for everything, but let's make innovation with all the constraints I acknowledge. But let's make innovation, real innovation, efficient innovation in healthcare a priority inside the constraints that we all have.
Agneta, you wanted to come in next, I think.
Yeah, just a short one. No, I think what if you want to have that more long-term perspective, and we know that many medicines, at least right now, they do come with a lot of uncertainties, but of course there are ways to handle those uncertainties and to share the risks, and that's where you have to be constructive and cooperate between the industry and the payers to see that, well, this we don't really know now, but within 3 years or 5 years maybe we know when we have more data. So we have to have prices and relating to that. So maybe if a few years later, maybe we can see, well, this is really worth while, so we can raise the price and we can pay more when it's proven even better. So I think we have to be a lot more constructive there to find ways to pay and to also have conditions within our decision making, that we say, well, we accept this price if you do this and this, and within 3 years we are able to revise the decision or something like that.
Because how much of that sort of value-based pricing actually is happening right now in Europe? Is it still very much an idea more than as a reality?
I think it's happening in certain areas. There are examples with some cancer medicines in certain countries where there have been some risk sharing type of pricing agreements. I think it is challenging because the investment in the innovation begins often 15 years, 10 years, between 10 and 15 years before the innovation actually is in front of HTA bodies. And then we're saying, yes, that, there's been an enormous investment to bring it to that point, that it has the opportunity to benefit human life, and then we can still find out more benefits. So there is a tricky balance, to steal words from Panos's initial comments, to try to strike. But I'd like to also pick up on Agneta's comment about more use potentially of the conditional approval, so that a benefit to an innovative pharmaceutical company could be that a product comes to market faster, but there is a risk, of course, that it could be withdrawn if the benefit isn't fully shown. And yeah. I think that's a balancing approach. It's been used pretty successfully in the US with accelerated approval. I know there are pathways in Europe too. So I think that there are ways that we can work together, and maybe experiment is not exactly the right word because it sounds too uncertain when we think of human health, but we do need to try to figure out how to balance the incentives for innovation appropriately with the need to demonstrate effectiveness and efficiency and indeed affordability. Again, borrowing from you, Panos, for the health systems.
Very, very interesting. Shall I move on to another question? Because we've got so many coming in. This one is from Fergal Donnelly. He's a research policy officer at the European Commission, and he asks about ethical reviews of products. He says some suggest that numerous local ethical reviews of potential products delay innovation. Is there a place for a European ethical review, like the European HTA, to resolve this issue with just a single ethical judgment, presumably to apply across the whole of the European Union? Peter, do you want to start on that one?
I guess I have to. This is, of course, a tricky one. I want, as an MEP, of course, Europe to be as harmonized as possible and not to make life of those that want to bring new innovation to the market more difficult. But yeah, when we discuss the clinical trials review it was important to have a role of the ethic bodies. And that was a very important priority of the European Parliament, because also trust of people in what we are doing is important. And the ethics bodies, also when they are at local level or at national level, you know, they increase the trust. And some member states don't even have an ethic body. In the draft at that time, it was due to be abolished. So I think we need to keep it, but we need to enable them to do their job fast and to focus on the issues that are really relevant for their constituency, and that they don't reinvent the wheel on issues that have been checked appropriately by others.
Panos, I know you sadly have to leave us in a moment, don't you? But did you want to quickly respond to this point, whether we need a pan-European ethical review?
Yes. I will probably stay on for a short while longer, but it is an interesting dimension here. Let's not forget that all our healthcare systems in Europe subscribe to universality and universal health insurance coverage, and that implies, you know, a very strong emphasis on equity. And the objective, one of the objectives of, let's say, reimbursement committees where health technology assessment agencies do not exist, or HTA organizations, is to ensure that decisions about coverage are taken on an ethical and therefore equitable, among other things, basis. And here is another area where this value-based assessment goes beyond traditional aspects of cost effectiveness. So we're not only looking at cost effectiveness analysis, which assumes maximization of utility based on a given budget. So technical efficiency, in other words, and maximization of health gain, given a given budget, but go beyond by introducing additional dimensions of benefit that ultimately guarantee that no one is left behind. And that takes us into the discussion we've had around rarity, unmet medical need, severity, and other dimensions of benefit, which are not necessarily as measurable as additional health gain, so to speak, but these are the, let's say, the softer, quote unquote, dimensions of value which are introduced by many, if not most, healthcare systems, one way or the other. In most cases, I have to say, on an ad hoc basis, with the exception of Sweden or France in the context of severity, and Sweden, as far as I remember, in the context of unmet medical need, and you know, and one or two other parameters which escape me at the moment. So yes, if as a united Europe, subscribe to the principles of universality, then we can interpret an ethics review in the context of those additional dimensions of benefit, for example, and have some commentary at least being offered once a new technology is being assessed, because the objective of the mechanism that has been introduced through the new regulation on HTA cooperation is assessment of clinical benefit, what is good, what is less good, what is missing, what should be, you know, what should be coming in the next few years, and so on and so forth, in terms of evidence and evidence generation. So my view would be that it may be a very nice add-on to what we're trying to do as a united Europe.
Deborah, would it help you as a manufacturer to have a single ethical review across Europe?
Well, listening to both sides, I was a little bit not sure whether we were referring to clinical trials, ethics review, where it certainly would help. I think we certainly have bumped into situations where we're very delayed in startup because of particular and not broad, firmly held beliefs about a particular issue in a clinical trial. So on that scale, it would help a lot. On an HTA scale, I think we're still going to bump into the fact that different countries will have different criteria for affordability, and therefore the technology assessment is there, and the data of progression-free survival in a cancer agent, or migraine-free days in a migraine therapy will be the same, but the ability of a country to devote resources to that will be different. So perhaps the technology assessment is one thing, but then each country is going to have to make their own determination of reimbursement.
Very interesting. Yes, the ethical context may look different depending on what your resources are and what the rival possibilities for spending are, I guess, in each country. Agneta, did you want?
Well, actually, I was thinking like Deborah. I wasn't really sure about the question, if it was more related to clinical trials or HTA. But as Panu said, when in our decision making, we do take into account on several ethical issues. Actually, there is an ethical platform that is part of the legislation from the parliament, and we need to look at the most needed have to go first, and also there is a solidarity principle, which is equality, and then also cost effectiveness. So we have 3 parameters, and that is really the ethical issue that we have included. And I think, like Deborah, I'm not sure if that should be formally be included on a European level, but I don't know. I haven't really thought about that issue before.
I'd like to add one more thing. Again, the question of unmet need and curative therapies, and those are wonderful, and there are definitely some of them, maybe more of them than they have been in the past, but many therapies are not curative, and yet a huge amount of our healthcare costs go to chronic diseases that are not curative. And innovation in making those chronic diseases less costly and less impactful, both for the health system and for the ability for society to be productive, are critical. And therefore, falling into the trap of defining unmet medical need as only being met if something has a curative intent, I think is tremendously counterproductive to what will be required to make our health system sustainable given the weight of chronic disease.
You're right. We could do an entire session on this. That I don't know. That perhaps the first point is the innovation cycle keeping pace with medical knowledge. Are treatments coming through sufficiently quickly once we have new medical knowledge? I don't know, Deborah. Do you want to start with that from your perspective?
I'd say the answer to that has to certainly be no.
Right.
I think the pace of understanding is increasing, and the cycle of innovation reaching patients has not really gone down. When I think about chronic diseases, often to generate the evidence that's required for efficacy and safety is still taking multiple years. And we haven't really made a tremendous amount of progress about how to gather that evidence faster. So I do think that there is a lag there. And with real novelty, some of the different modalities that have been used, gene therapy, the oligonucleotides, the mRNAs, there is a lot to be known to protect the safety of populations. So it's not to say that we should suddenly shorten the amount of time and the required amount of evidence. And I think this is where the partnership with regulators has been positive. and can be strengthened further in looking at what is the, in a high unmet need, significantly life-threatening disease, what is the amount of evidence required for a conditional approval? What are the conditions of that approval, and what is required to get to a full approval? I think that's a way to broker an appropriate balance of risk and benefit to human health that we as industry want to preserve, and regulators are required to preserve for the populations that they represent.
And Agneta, you mentioned earlier that you don't always feel you do have enough evidence or enough data when medicines are brought to you for your judgment. Do you think there's a way of speeding that up, or is there always going to be a lag?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I think we could be quicker, but also we need to get more information in advance,
Right.
in advance, and then also be better to follow up also. But I think it's not easy to keep up the speed, but it need to be quicker. I think so.
And then just very quickly, gentlemen, you've each got about a minute to make a point. Peter, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, I can do it short. I just want to add 2 points that are hopefully addressed in the Commission proposal the day after tomorrow, but we hadn't have a chance to discuss. The first one is antimicrobial resistance. So we need innovation here. The question is, what is the right price? What is the right incentive? And how can we assure prudent use finally? So this is, the cost is enormous, but what is the best question to address it? And then the best innovation doesn't help if you don't have availability of the drug. We have this huge problem of shortage of drugs. And I think when you ask average people, what is the biggest problem in pharmaceutical legislation when you discuss pharmaceuticals as a whole? Yeah, I didn't get the fever medicine for my children. So that should not be underestimated in the political debate.
No, good point. And Panos, a very quick comment from you.
Very, very quick point. I think both regulators and healthcare systems, regulatory agencies and healthcare systems will probably need to think about the type of evidence and the intensity of evidence that needs to be submitted, so to speak, at the point of approving a new medicine. Other jurisdictions have also introduced parallel reviews, which suggest a concurrent assessment and appraisal, a concurrent regulatory assessment and an HTA assessment come appraisal. So I suspect with the HTA regulation, this is where we are getting towards. The other thing which is interesting to bear in mind is the type of incentive, and that type of incentivization for truly innovative treatments may be different depending on what our priorities are. So I think we probably need to have yet another perhaps discussion on some of our priorities. The evidence has suggested that innovators and industry actually do respond to positive incentives, as the orphan disease regulation has shown over the past 20 years in Europe, and another 10 years before that in the United States. So tailoring, therefore, the incentive appropriately.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid the clock has now beaten us. So I'd like to thank EFPIA again very much for partnering with us. And of course, all of our speakers, our wonderful speakers here today, and our delegates for participating. Thank you very much, everybody listening, for your insightful questions. And I'm very sorry that I didn't have time to get to all of them. If you did want to listen back to the discussion, we've got a video on demand available for the next 30 days. And if you wanted to keep in touch with others tuned into this webinar, do use the community networking feature, which you can find on the top menu of the website. And we look forward to seeing everybody at future events between EFPIA and the FT. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.